At the checkout line, I paid for an elderly woman's groceries because her card was declined. She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "When your husband leaves you, do not touch the snow in the backyard. The devil cannot hide his heat." I laughed it off as senile rambling, but the next morning, standing on my porch wrapped in a thin blanket, I nearly collapsed at what I saw. A perfect circle of melted earth in the middle of a frozen lawn, steaming in the cold Atlanta air. It looked exactly like a fresh grave. My name is Nia, and at 30 years old, I thought I had built a fortress of a life. I was wrong. Before I tell you about the secret buried in my yard that destroyed my entire family, hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. The nightmare started 3 days before the snow fell. I came home early from the data analytics firm I helped build. The penthouse was quiet, too quiet. I walked into the living room and froze. My husband, Preston, was sitting on our white Italian leather sofa. My younger sister, Keisha, was curled up next to him, her feet resting comfortably in his lap. They were drinking a bottle of vintage Chablis I had been saving for our 5th anniversary. They did not jump up. They did not scramble to cover themselves. They did not even look guilty. Preston just looked at me with his icy blue eyes, took a slow sip of wine, and slid a thick manila envelope across the marble coffee table. It slid across the surface with a hiss and stopped right at my feet. I looked from the envelope to my sister. Keisha smirked, adjusting the expensive silk robe she was wearing. My robe. "You should thank us, Nia," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You are always too boring for a man like Preston. He needs a woman who understands the spotlight, not a calculator in a skirt." I felt the blood drain from my face. I picked up the envelope. Divorce papers. The ink was already dry. Preston finally stood up, smoothing his tailored suit jacket. He looked at me like I was a low-level employee he was firing for incompetence. "It is nothing personal, Nia," he said calmly. "You are safe. You are practical. But Keisha is a star. I need a partner who shines, and quite frankly, you have become invisible. Sign the papers by tomorrow. You get to keep your car. We are keeping the house." I stood there, clutching my briefcase until my knuckles turned white. My own sister was drinking my wine in my house, stealing my husband, and calling me boring. I did not scream. I did not throw the wine glass at the wall. I am a data analyst. I process information. And the information right in front of me said that my life was being deleted. But as I looked at Keisha's triumphant smile, I realized they had made a fatal calculation. They thought they were stealing a house. They did not know they were stealing a crime scene. The next morning, I drove to the headquarters of Apex Analytics with my heart hammering against my ribs. I had spent 5 years building this company, from a basement startup into a premier data firm in Atlanta. It was my sanctuary. Or so I thought. I walked up to the glass turnstiles and swiped my security badge. A harsh buzz sounded. The light flashed red. Access denied. I frowned and swiped again. Denied. I looked at the receptionist, a young girl named Sarah I had personally hired and mentored. "Sarah, my badge is malfunctioning," I said, forcing a smile. She did not look up. Her eyes were glued to her monitor, her shoulders hunched. I slammed my hand on the desk. "Sarah, look at me!" Before she could answer, the double doors to the executive suite burst open. Preston walked out. He was not wearing the casual clothes he usually wore to his consulting gig. He was wearing a three-piece suit that screamed power. Flanking him were two armed security guards I did not recognize. I stepped forward. Preston, stop playing games. Why is my badge locked out? He stopped 5 feet away from me, checking his watch like I was a minor inconvenience in his schedule. You do not work here anymore, Nia. The board convened an emergency meeting at midnight. Due to your unstable mental state regarding the divorce, they voted to trigger the morality clause in your contract. Your shares have been bought out at par value. Hostile takeover complete. I gasped. That is illegal. You bribed them. You used the joint account funds we froze. He shrugged. I did what was necessary to save the company image. Speaking of image, meet our new director of brand aesthetics. From behind his shoulder, Keisha popped out. She was holding her phone up, the recording light blinking red. Hey guys, she chirped to her live stream audience. You are watching history. We are clearing out the negative energy today. Look at her, so desperate. She shoved the camera in my face. Smile, Nia. You are trending. I reached for her phone, but the guards grabbed me. One of them twisted my arm behind my back so hard I felt my shoulder pop. Jerry, the head of security who had known me for years, stood by the elevator, looking at the floor. Jerry, help me! I screamed. He did not move. Preston nodded to the guards. Get her out of my building. They dragged me backward, across the polished concrete floor I had picked out myself. My heels scraped against the surface, a screeching sound that silenced the entire open-plan office. 50 employees, people whose mortgages were paid because of my code, watched in silence. No one stood up. No one said a word. They were terrified of the new boss. The guards shoved me through the revolving doors and threw me onto the wet pavement. My purse landed in a puddle of dirty rainwater. Above me, on the second-floor balcony, Keisha was still filming, blowing a kiss to her followers. I sat there on the cold concrete, stripped of my title, my income, and my dignity in the span of 10 minutes. But Preston had made a mistake. He fired Nia Ward. He did not know that legally, Nia Ward did not exist to be fired. With the taste of blood in my mouth and rain soaking through my clothes, I drove to the only sanctuary I had left, my mother's house in Cascade Heights. I told myself that Vernice Ward would be furious. She was a deaconess in the church, a pillar of the community. Surely she would not stand for her oldest daughter being robbed blind by her own flesh and blood. I pulled into the driveway, my hands shaking so hard I could barely shift the gear into park. The porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow that usually meant safety. But as I stepped out of the car, the front door flew open with violent force. I expected open arms. Instead, I was greeted by a projectile. My vintage leather suitcase, the one I kept in her guest closet for emergencies, came sailing through the air. It hit the wet grass with a heavy thud, splashing mud onto my ankles. Vernice stood on the porch, looming over me like a judge handing down a death sentence. She was wearing a silk caftan and a diamond tennis bracelet I had never seen before. It glittered menacingly under the porch light. "Do not you dare bring your drama here, Nia," she shouted, her voice cutting through the humid air. "I do not want the neighbors seeing you looking like a drowned rat." I walked toward the steps, ignoring the suitcase. "Mom, please. They took everything. Preston locked me out of the accounts. Keisha fired me. They left me with nothing." I reached out for the railing, but she moved to block the stairs. She did not look concerned. She looked annoyed. I know what happened, she said coldly. Preston called me. He told me you were making a scene. You need to grow up. I froze. You are taking his side? He is a thief. He is sleeping with Keisha. Vernice let out a sharp laugh. He is not a thief, Nia. He is a businessman. And as for Keisha, she is finally securing her future. Do you know what kind of life Preston can give her? He is a wealthy white man with connections in high finance. He can elevate this entire family. You were holding him back with your small thinking. But Keisha? She shines. She looks good on his arm. She walked down one step, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive perfume she had undoubtedly bought with Preston's bribe money. Listen to me clearly. Preston promised me a 3-bedroom condo in Boca Raton once the wedding is official. Ocean view. Floor-to-ceiling windows. I have spent my whole life taking care of you ungrateful children. I deserve to retire in luxury. I am not letting your jealousy ruin my Florida dream. My stomach twisted. You are selling me out for a condo? I whispered. She straightened up, her face hardening into stone. You are the oldest, Nia. You have always been the strong one, the mule. You can survive on your own. You have your little degrees. But Keisha needs this. She needs to be taken care of. It is your duty to sacrifice for your sister. That is what family does. So get your trash off my lawn. Go find a cheap motel and do not come back until you are ready to apologize to the bride and groom. She turned her back on me and walked inside. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the deadbolt slid home with a final metallic click. I stood there in the rain, staring at the closed door. My husband took my money. My sister took my life. And my mother had sold me for a view of the ocean. I dragged my suitcase to the car, shivering not from the cold, but from the absolute hollowness in my chest. I had nowhere to go. No friends who were not loyal to Preston, no family, just a half tank of gas and a burning rage that was starting to keep me warm. I drove aimlessly for hours until the fuel light on my dashboard pinged, a cruel reminder that I had no money to fill the tank. The temperature in Atlanta had plummeted, a rare winter freeze that turned the roads into sheets of black ice. I pulled into a desolate gas station near the old neighborhood, just to sit under the harsh fluorescent lights and think. That is when I saw her. Sitting on a rusted bench at the bus stop across the street, wrapped in a faded wool coat, was Hattie. Hattie had been our housekeeper for 20 years until Preston fired her last month for budget cuts. She had dried more of my tears than my own mother ever had. I ran across the street, my heels slipping on the pavement. "Hattie!" I called out, my voice cracking. She looked up, her eyes milky with age but sharp with recognition. She did not look surprised to see me. She pulled me onto the bench beside her, her hands warm despite the bitter cold. "I know, child," she whispered before I could speak. "I saw the news online. That man has a heart made of coal." I buried my face in her shoulder, finally letting a sob escape. "He took everything, Hattie. The house, the company. Mom even sided with him. She threw me out." Hattie stiffened. She gripped my arm, her fingers digging into my coat with surprising strength. "Listen to me, Nia. He did not take the house because he likes the architecture. He took it because of what is underneath the backyard." I pulled back, wiping my eyes, confused. "What are you talking about?" Hattie looked around nervously, checking the empty street, then leaned close. When I was cleaning the study, I saw maps, old geological maps. And I heard him on the phone talking about extraction rights. Why do you think he fired me? I was asking too many questions about the heavy equipment he was ordering. She pointed a trembling finger toward the direction of my old subdivision. It is snowing tonight, Nia. Go look at the backyard. The snow covers the lies, but it cannot cover the heat. If you want to beat him, you need to see what the ground is rejecting. I left Hattie with the last $20 I had in my glove compartment and drove to the house. My house. The windows were dark. Preston and Keisha must have gone out to celebrate their victory. I parked 3 streets away and trekked through the woods that bordered the property. The cold bit through my thin blouse, numbing my skin, but Hattie's words burned in my mind. I reached the wrought iron fence and squeezed through a gap I used to use as a teenager. The backyard was a vast expanse of white, untouched and silent, except for one spot. Near the old oak tree, in the far corner where my grandfather used to sit, there was a perfect circle of dark, muddy earth. It looked like a wound in the landscape. The snow falling from the sky melted the instant it touched the ground. Steam rose from the soil in faint, ghostly wisps. Hattie was right. The ground was hot. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the warm mud. What was down there? A geothermal leak? A buried secret? I knelt to touch the earth, but before my fingers could graze the soil, a deafening sound shattered the silence. The perimeter alarm. I had triggered the sensors Preston had just installed. The piercing wail of the security system dropped me to my knees. It was a sound I knew well because I had coded the sensitivity parameters myself 3 years ago to protect my family. Now that same code was treating me like a hostile intruder. Before I could even stand up, the blinding beams of floodlights cut through the darkness, pinning me against the oak tree like a deer in headlights. Then came the sirens, screaming closer and closer until blue and red lights washed over the snow, turning the peaceful white yard into a chaotic strobe light show. I raised my hands, blinded by the glare. "Officers, it is a mistake!" I shouted over the noise. "I live here!" "I am Nia Ward." 2 officers stormed through the broken gate with weapons drawn. They did not see a homeowner in distress. They saw a black woman in a high-end neighborhood wearing muddy clothes in the middle of the night. One of them slammed me against the cold brick of the retaining wall. "Stop moving! You are under arrest for criminal trespass and attempted burglary." I gasped as the cold steel of handcuffs bit into my wrists, the metal instantly freezing against my skin. "Check the deed!" I screamed, my face pressed against the rough stone. "My name is on the title. I paid the mortgage." The officer did not even hesitate as he patted me down. "Dispatch already ran the address, ma'am. The sole owner is Mr. Preston Vance. We have no record of a Nia Ward residing at this property. You have no legal standing here." That is when I saw him. The French doors to the master bedroom opened above us, and Preston stepped out onto the balcony. He was still wearing his suit, holding that same glass of wine from earlier. He looked down at the scene, at his wife being manhandled by police in the mud, with the detached curiosity of someone watching a reality TV show. He did not yell. He did not ask them to stop. He simply leaned against the railing, took a slow, deliberate sip of Chablis, and offered a small, polite nod to the sergeant. That nod sealed my fate. It was his silent testimony that I was a stranger. As they dragged me toward the squad car, my boots dragging through the slush, I locked eyes with him one last time. He mouthed 2 words, clear enough for me to read even from the distance. Game over. The heavy door of the cruiser slammed shut, trapping me in the smell of stale coffee and sweat. I watched my house disappear through the wire mesh of the window. I had paid for every brick. I had designed the security system. I had planted the garden. But as we sped away toward the precinct, the terrifying reality settled in. Preston had not just changed the locks. He had rewritten reality. In the eyes of the law, Nia Ward had been erased from that property long before the handcuffs clicked shut. The holding cell smelled of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies, a scent that stuck to the back of my throat. I sat on the cold steel bench, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to stop the shivering. My expensive blouse was ruined, stained with mud and sweat, a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit of the woman sleeping fitfully next to me. I had processed data for Fortune 500 companies, but I could not process how I ended up here. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Preston standing on that balcony sipping his wine. 3 hours later, the heavy metal door buzzed open. Officer Miller, the one who had booked me, stood there with a clipboard. "You made bail, Ward. Your husband is waiting in the lobby." A wave of relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion. Why would Preston call the cops only to bail me out? Was this some twisted game? Or had he finally realized he had gone too far? I gathered my things, my muddy shoes squeaking on the linoleum as I followed the officer down the hallway. Preston was standing near the exit, looking out at the dark street. He looked immaculate in his charcoal suit, not a hair out of place, completely unaffected by the chaos he had caused. When I approached him, I expected an apology, or at least a smug comment about teaching me a lesson. I did not expect the look of absolute emptiness in his eyes. He did not hand me a coat. He did not offer me a ride. He simply held out a document for me to see. It was the bail receipt. "You are free to go, Nia," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "But do not go back to the house. I have already filed for a restraining order." I stared at him, my hands trembling. "You cannot do this! I own half that property. We are married." Preston stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the expensive Chablis on his breath. He lowered his voice to a whisper so the desk sergeant could not hear. "That is the funny part, Nia. I had my lawyers run a deep background check on you before I filed the papers. We found something interesting in the federal archives. Or rather, we found nothing." He smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "You keep saying you own things. You keep saying you have rights. But according to the United States government, Nia Ward does not exist. You are a ghost. And ghosts do not own property. Ghosts do not have marital rights." He turned and walked through the automatic doors. I ran after him, the freezing night air hitting me like a physical blow. "Preston, what are you talking about?" He ignored me, sliding into the driver's seat of his Tesla, the car I had paid off last month. He rolled down the window just an inch. "Good luck out there, Nia. Try not to freeze." The electric engine whirred to life, and he sped away, his taillights disappearing into the Atlanta fog. I stood on the curb at 3 a.m. with no coat, no wallet, and a dead phone, wondering what he meant. I was shivering violently, but his words chilled me more than the wind. I did not know it then, but Preston had just given me the first clue to the mystery of my own life. I started walking toward the only place that would take a woman with nothing, the homeless shelter on Pine Street. The Pine Street shelter was a crumbling brick building that smelled of despair and stale cigarette smoke. It was a place I had driven past 1,000 times in my luxury sedan, never once imagining I would be standing in line for a cot. I pulled my collar up to hide my face, but in this place, nobody cared about my shame. They only cared about survival. I reached the front of the line, where a woman named Miss Clara sat behind a bulletproof glass partition. She was a formidable figure with silver dreadlocks and eyes that looked like they could see right through your soul. She did not look up as she tapped a pen on the desk. "Name," she barked. I cleared my throat, my voice trembling. "Nia Ward?" She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She looked at my muddy designer clothes, then at my face. "You are new to the system, honey." I nodded, fighting back tears. "Yes. My husband threw me out. I just need a bed for the night." She grunted and started typing. The rhythmic clicking of the keys was the only sound in the small intake office. I watched the screen, waiting for the standard registration form to appear. Instead, a harsh, discordant beep echoed through the room. The screen did not just flash, it turned a solid, angry crimson. Miss Clara stopped typing immediately. Her entire demeanor changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp predator's alertness. She did not ask me to repeat my name. She did not ask for my ID. Instead, her hand moved slowly under the desk. A loud magnetic clack signaled that the heavy steel door behind me had just been remotely locked. I spun around, panic rising in my throat. "What is going on? Let me out!" When I turned back, Miss Clara was standing up. In her hand was not a pen, but a high-voltage taser, sparking with a menacing blue light. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice low and dangerous. I backed away until my back hit the locked door, holding my hands up. "Please, I have not done anything. I just need help." She kept the weapon trained on my chest, moving around the desk to block my only exit. "Who sent you? Was it the feds? Or are you just some sick con artist playing games with a dead girl's memory?" I stared at her, confused and terrified. "I do not understand." "I am Nia Ward. I was born in Atlanta. I have a social security number. I have a life." Miss Clara laughed, a dry, humorless sound that chilled me to the bone. She reached over and spun the monitor around so I could see it. There was my name, Nia Ward. But underneath it, in bold block letters, was a status that made my blood run cold. Deceased. Date of death, May 14th, 1998. Cause of death, drowning. Miss Clara leaned in close, the taser humming in the silence between us. "Honey, according to the United States government, Nia Ward has been rotting in a grave for 26 years. You are not supposed to exist. So you have exactly 10 seconds to tell me who you really are before I call the marshals and have you thrown in a hole so deep you will never see the sun again." My eyes locked onto the pixelated document on the screen. It was a scanned copy of a standard death certificate from Fulton County. The name was mine, the birth date was mine, but the date of death was 26 years ago. Cause of death was listed as accidental drowning in the Chattahoochee River. I felt the room spin. I was 4 years old in 1998. I remembered that summer. I remembered playing in the sprinkler, not drowning in a river. Miss Clara saw the color drain from my face. She saw the genuine, absolute horror that no con artist could fake. Slowly, the blue spark of the taser died down. She lowered her arm but kept her eyes on me. "You really do not know, do you?" She typed a few more commands, opening a financial subwindow. Look right here. Life insurance payout. $500,000. Paid to beneficiaries Vernice and Thomas Ward. The air left my lungs. My parents. My church-going, respectable parents. The memories hit me like a physical blow, a cascade of red flags I had ignored my entire life. I remembered wanting to go to Paris for my senior trip with the French club. Mom screamed at me, forbidding me to get a passport, claiming international travel was dangerous. I remembered when I turned 16 and wanted a driver's license. Dad insisted on driving me to a specific DMV in a rural county 3 hours away. He claimed the lines were shorter, but I saw him slip an envelope to the clerk. They had been managing my existence off the books for 3 decades. My Social Security card, my birth certificate, even the marriage license I signed with Preston. They were all high-quality forgeries or obtained through bribery and loopholes. To the world, I was Nia Ward, but to the federal government, I was a closed file. I had spent 30 years studying, working, paying taxes, and building a career, all while legally rotting in a pauper's grave. My parents had not just neglected me in favor of Keisha. They had harvested me. To them, I was worth more dead than alive. They took that $500,000 and used it to buy the house in Cascade Heights, the same house my mother just kicked me out of. They built their comfortable life, their reputation, and their golden child's future on my tombstone. Preston must have found this out during his background check. That was why he was so confident. He knew he could take everything because legally, I could not own anything. I could not sue him. I could not even report him. I looked up at Miss Clara. Tears were streaming down my face, but behind the tears, a cold, hard logic was forming. Preston said I was a ghost. He thought that made me weak. He thought that meant I was powerless. But as I looked at that death certificate, I realized something else. Ghosts are dangerous for one specific reason. They operate outside the law, and they haunt the living until justice is served. The mirror in the communal bathroom was held together by duct tape and grim determination. I stared at the fractured reflection of the woman staring back at me. She looked exhausted. Her hair was matted, her designer clothes were ruined, and her eyes were red from crying. But as I splashed cold water on my face, the panic that had been gripping my chest began to loosen. I looked deeper into my own eyes and realized something profound. Preston thought he had destroyed me by revealing I was a ghost. He thought he had stripped me of my rights. But he was wrong. He had not disarmed me. He had just handed me the ultimate weapon. I started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle and rose to a sound that echoed off the dirty tile walls. The woman in the stall behind me probably thought I had snapped, and maybe I had. But the logic was crystal clear. If I am dead, I cannot break the law. A dead woman cannot violate a restraining order. A dead woman cannot be sued for defamation. A dead woman has no credit score to ruin and no reputation to protect. My parents had stolen my life to make a quick buck, but in doing so, they had given me total immunity. I was invisible, and there is nothing more dangerous than an enemy you cannot see. I dried my face with a rough paper towel and walked back to the intake desk. Miss Clara was still there, watching me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She had her hand on the phone, ready to call the authorities. I placed my hands flat on her desk and leaned in. Do not call the marshals, Clara. Call a lawyer. But I do not want a corporate suit. I want a shark. I want someone who hates the system as much as you do. Clara looked at me for a long moment, assessing the new fire in my eyes. Then, slowly, a grin spread across her face, revealing a gold tooth. She put the receiver down and reached into her bag for a burner phone. "I know just the guy," she said. "He owes me a favor for keeping his little brother out of juvie." 30 minutes later, the heavy steel doors buzzed open to admit a young man who looked like he had not slept in a week. His suit was cheap polyester, his tie was crooked, and he carried a briefcase that was held together by electrical tape. This was Marcus. He was a public defender who spent his days in the trenches, fighting for people the city wanted to forget. When Clara explained my situation, the fake death certificate, the insurance fraud, the stolen property, Marcus did not look sympathetic. He looked hungry. He paced around the small office, rubbing his chin. "Let me get this straight," he said, his energy filling the room. "Your husband thinks you are powerless because you have no legal standing. Your parents are sitting on a federal felony that has no statute of limitations because fraud is an ongoing crime. And nobody is looking for you because, on paper, you are rotting in the Chattahoochee River." He stopped and looked at me, a wild excitement in his eyes. "Nia, this is not a legal disaster. This is a tactical nuke. We are not just going to sue them. We are going to dismantle their lives. We are going to use your death to bury them." We sat in that cramped office until dawn, the three of us forming an unholy alliance. A dead woman, a cynical social worker, and a lawyer with a grudge against the world. Marcus laid out the plan. We would not fight them in court, not yet. We would fight them from the shadows. We would use the very thing they used against me, my non-existence, to infiltrate, sabotage, and destroy. By the time the sun came up over Atlanta, Nia Ward, the victim, was gone. Nia the ghost was ready to go to work. We needed ammunition, and Hattie provided the nuclear warhead. We met her at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from the prying eyes of my mother's church friends. Hattie pulled a crumbling, leather-bound journal from her purse. It smelled of tobacco and lavender, the signature scent of my great-grandfather Silas. I had not seen this book since I was a child. Hattie opened it to a hand-drawn map of the Cascade Heights property. "Your great-grandfather Silas was not just a farmer, Nia," Hattie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was a visionary. Everyone in 1920 thought he was foolish for buying that rocky patch of land where nothing would grow. But Silas knew what was beneath the rock. He used to tell me that the ground had a fever, that the earth was sweating money." She pointed to the drawing of the old stone well in the backyard, the exact spot where I had seen the snow melting. That well was never meant for water. Silas built it to cap a geothermal vent. But it is not just heat down there. It is lithium. A massive, high-density vein of lithium, the white gold that powers every electric car and smartphone on the planet. My jaw dropped. I looked at Marcus, who was already typing furiously on his laptop. It made sense. The heat Hattie described, the melting snow, the geological reports Preston had been secretly studying. The heat from the chemical reaction in the vein was rising to the surface. That was why the snow refused to settle. Hattie continued. Preston found the old geological surveys in the attic. I saw him reading them. He realized he was sitting on a mine worth hundreds of millions, maybe billions, but he had a problem. To start a mining operation in a residential zone, you need the signature of the absolute title holder. You need a clean deed. Marcus looked up from his screen, his eyes wide. and a dead woman cannot sign a mining permit. That is the snag. If Preston admitted you were alive, he would have to split the assets with you in the divorce. But if you stay dead, the property technically reverts to your next of kin under the specific trust clause Silas wrote. That would be your parents. But your parents are old. They would ask questions. Hattie nodded. Exactly. So Preston seduced Keisha. He convinced your parents to sign over the property rights to her as a wedding gift, claiming it was to keep the asset in the family. Once he marries Keisha, he controls her. He gets her signature on the mining contracts, and he cuts your parents out completely. He is trading a wife he cannot use for a wife he can exploit. I stared at the map. Preston was not just a cheater. He was a corporate raider, dismantling my family for mineral rights. He was going to turn my grandfather's legacy into an open-pit mine and leave Keisha with nothing but a polluted crater. But he had made one critical error. He based his entire billion-dollar scheme on the assumption that the ghost of Nia Ward would stay quiet. He forgot that Grandfather Silas left that journal to Hattie, not to him. And now, the ghost had the map. I sat in the corner of Marcus's cramped office, the blue light of 3 monitors reflecting in my glasses. The air conditioner rattled overhead, a stark contrast to the silent, climate-controlled server rooms I was used to. Preston thought he had stripped me of my assets, but he forgot a crucial detail. I built the cybersecurity infrastructure for his boutique hedge fund. I knew his passwords. I knew the name of his first pet. And most importantly, I knew that he never changed the admin backdoor I created for emergency maintenance years ago. My fingers flew across the sticky keyboard, executing a script that bypassed his 2-factor authentication in seconds. A green prompt flashed on the screen. Access granted. Marcus leaned over my shoulder, chewing on the end of a pen. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "Evidence of fraud, hidden accounts, anything we can use," I replied, navigating through the labyrinth of his digital files. I opened his private ledger, hidden deep within a folder innocuously named Old Tax Documents. I expected to see millions stashed away in the Caymans. Instead, the numbers on the screen were a sea of red. Preston Vance, the man who drove a Tesla and drank vintage Chablis, was hemorrhaging cash. His credit cards were maxed out. His country club membership was suspended for non-payment. The lease on his luxury SUV was 3 months behind. But it was not just bad investments. It was something far darker. I pulled up a thread of threatening emails from an encrypted sender known only as the Syndicate. The subject lines were terrifyingly simple. Payment overdue. Final warning. Asset liquidation. I opened the latest one, sent just 2 hours ago. Mr. Vance, your grace period expires in exactly 7 days. If the remaining balance of $5 million is not transferred to the offshore account by midnight next Sunday, we will not seize your assets. We will collect the debt in flesh. Attached to the email was a surveillance photo of Preston walking out of his gym, a red target circle photoshopped onto his chest. Marcus let out a low whistle. $5 million. He is not just broke, Nia. He is a dead man walking. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The rush to divorce me, the frantic speed of the wedding to Keisha, the desperation to get the land title signed over. Preston was not building an empire for my sister. He was trying to save his own skin. He needed that lithium deal to pay off the sharks before they executed him. He was fronting a lifestyle he could not afford, using my family's inheritance as his bail money. I leaned back in the creaky office chair, a cold smile touching my lips as I stared at the surveillance photo. He called me boring. He called me a calculator. But this calculator just figured out his expiration date. He has a deadline, I whispered, turning to Marcus. 7 days. If he does not sell the land by then, the syndicate takes him out. Marcus looked at me, realizing the implication. So we do not have to destroy him, he said. We just have to delay him. Exactly, I said, closing the laptop with a snap. He is on a timer, and I am about to become the glitch in his system. Hey, my loves, welcome back to the channel. I hope you are manifesting abundance today, because look at what my king just put on my finger. Keisha held her hand up to the ring light, the massive stone fracturing the light into 1,000 sparkles. She tilted her head, perfecting the angle for her 200,000 followers. Preston just knows how to treat a woman who knows her worth. No more settling for dusty behavior, ladies. Level up. She blew a kiss to the camera and tapped End Stream. The moment the screen went dark, the smile vanished from her face like a filter being swiped away. She slumped back onto the velvet chaise lounge, rubbing her temples. The performance was exhausting, but the reality was about to get much worse. The heavy oak door slammed open. Preston stormed in, ripping his tie off as if it were choking him. He did not look like the doting fiancé she had just described. He looked like a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the room until they landed on the bright orange shopping bag sitting on the vanity. An Hermes Birkin. The trophy she had bought herself to celebrate the engagement. "What is that?" Preston barked, pointing a shaking finger at the bag. Keisha sat up, trying to maintain her bravado. "It is a gift. From me to me." "I need to look the part for the wedding photos, right? You said image is everything." Preston crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed the bag. He upended it, dumping the $30,000 leather purse onto the floor. "Take it back," he snarled. "Take it back right now and get a refund." Keisha stood up, her voice rising. "Excuse me? You just bought $1 million ring. Why are you tripping over a bag? We are rich, Preston. Act like it." Preston laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her close. "That ring is a prop, Keisha. Just like this apartment, just like you. We are not spending liquid cash on leather sacks. We are bleeding money until that land deal goes through. Do you understand me? You do not spend a dime unless I approve it." He released her wrist with a shove and stormed out, kicking the bag across the room as he left. Keisha stood there, trembling. She looked down at the massive diamond on her finger. Under the harsh bedroom lights, without the ring light to enhance it, the stone looked dull. It looked cloudy. For the first time, a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She had betrayed her sister to secure the bag, but looking at the man storming down the hall, she realized she might have just sold her soul for cubic zirconia. She picked up her phone to call Mom, but stopped. She could not admit Nia was right. She was trapped in the castle she had stolen, and the walls were starting to close in. The weapon I chose for the first strike was not digital. It was paper. A single, crisp photocopy of the death certificate my parents had signed 26 years ago. I did not include a note. I did not include a threat. I simply highlighted the date of death in neon yellow marker and addressed the envelope to Mrs. Vernice Ward. I did not send it to Preston. Preston was a sociopath who would just burn it. I sent it to the weak link. I sent it to my mother. I parked my rental car 2 blocks away from the house I grew up in, watching through a pair of binoculars as the mail carrier walked up the driveway. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning. The birds were singing, the lawn was manicured, and Vernice Ward was sitting on her porch swinging chair, drinking herbal tea and reading a Bible study guide. She looked the picture of pious tranquility. Then the mailman handed her the stack of envelopes. She smiled at him, the same fake sweet smile she used on the church deacons. I watched her flip through the bills and junk mail until she reached the plain white envelope with no return address. She used a silver letter opener to slit the top. She pulled out the document. Even from this distance, I saw her body go rigid. The teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the porch, spilling hot liquid over her slippers, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at the paper, her chest heaving. The ghost of her past had just walked onto her porch and sat down next to her. She scrambled for her phone, her fingers fumbling over the screen. I did not need to hack her line to know who she was calling. I could see her mouth moving frantically, her eyes darting around the yard as if she expected the police to jump out of the bushes. On the other end of the line, Preston was likely in a meeting, but he picked up. I imagined the conversation perfectly. Vernice was hysterical. "She sent it, Preston. She knows. She sent the certificate. She is going to turn us in. We are going to prison." I could practically hear Preston's voice, smooth and condescending, trying to talk her off the ledge. "Calm down, Vernice," he would say. "Think about it. She cannot go to the police. If she walks into a precinct and shows them that paper, she admits to using a fake identity for 30 years. She would be arresting herself. She is bluffing. She is trying to scare you because she is desperate. She is a ghost, Vernice. And ghosts cannot testify in court without exposing their own crimes." I lowered the binoculars, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. Preston was predictable. He was betting on my self-preservation. He thought I was still the old Nia, the rule follower, the woman who was terrified of getting in trouble. He thought the threat of jail time for identity fraud would keep me silent. He was right about the legal gridlock, but he was wrong about me. He did not understand that when you have lost your home, your name, and your dignity, you stop fearing consequences. He thought he had checkmated me. He did not realize I was not playing chess anymore. I was playing waiting games. And now that I had rattled the cage, I just had to wait for them to make a mistake. The next morning, Preston walked into the private wealth division of First Sovereign Bank, looking like a man who owned the world. He was wearing a navy bespoke suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained the fraudulent appraisal documents for the land. From the security feed Marcus had tapped into, I watched him shake hands with Mr. Henderson, the senior loan officer. Preston was smiling that shark-like smile, confident that his charm would bulldoze through any red tape. He needed $5 million liquid cash by Sunday, or the syndicate would collect their debt in blood. He thought this meeting was a formality. He was wrong. I watched Mr. Henderson open the file on his desk. He did not smile back. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Preston with the kind of pity reserved for terminal patients. "Mr. Vance, I am afraid we have hit a snag." Preston laughed, a dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet office. "What kind of snag, Henderson? My credit is impeccable. The land is appraised at $50 million. Just cut the check so I can get back to my wedding planning." Henderson slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany desk. "It is not your credit, Mr. Vance. It is the collateral. As of 9 o'clock this morning, a formal notice of dispute was filed against the property title, a lis pendens. It effectively freezes the asset. We cannot issue a mortgage on a property with a clouded title." Preston went rigid. His charm evaporated instantly, replaced by a terrifying intensity. Who filed it? Who disputed the title? The owner is dead. Henderson looked at his computer screen nervously. The claimant is anonymous, Mr. Vance, but the filing cites a federal investigation regarding insurance fraud and identity theft linked to the original deed. Until this is resolved, the bank cannot touch that land. It is radioactive. Preston stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the marble floor. "That is a lie!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "There is no investigation. This is a glitch. Override it. I need that money today." Henderson reached for the silent alarm button under his desk. "I cannot override federal flagging, Mr. Vance. Please lower your voice or I will have to ask you to leave." Preston slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling the framed photos of Henderson's grandchildren. "Do you know who I am? I am Preston Vance. I am marrying into the Ward family. That land is mine. Give me the money." He was not just angry. He was terrified. He could hear the clock ticking down on his life. 2 armed security guards entered the room. They were not the polite concierge security at the front desk. These were big men who handled bank robbers. They grabbed Preston by the arms. He thrashed against them, shouting obscenities, threatening to sue the bank, to buy the building, to fire everyone. But as they dragged him through the lobby past the shocked faces of other customers, he looked small. He looked desperate. They tossed him out onto the sidewalk the same way he had tossed me out of my own company. He scrambled to his feet, straightening his jacket, trying to regain his composure. But the damage was done. He had no money. He had no loan. And he had a $5 million price on his head that was due in 6 days. As he stood there hyperventilating on the pavement, he pulled out his phone and dialed the one person he thought he could still control. He dialed Keisha. But he did not know that I was already on my way to intercept her, too. The ghost was closing in. I tracked the GPS signal of the burner phone Preston had given her. It led me to the back lot of a high-end bridal salon in Buckhead. I pulled my beat-up rental car directly behind her white Range Rover, blocking her in. She looked in the rearview mirror, her eyes widening in annoyance rather than fear. She slammed the door open and stepped out, still wearing a silk sash that said bride-to-be. "Get out of my way, Nia," she hissed, checking her nails. "I do not have time for your homeless sob story. I have a tasting in 20 minutes. I did not move. I walked right up to her, invading her personal space. "He does not have the money, Keisha," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I hacked his accounts. He owes $5 million to a cartel. If he does not sell the land by Sunday, they are going to kill him. And if you marry him, you inherit that debt. He is not making you a wife. He is making you a human shield." Keisha paused. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt. But then the entitlement washed it away. She laughed, a cruel, high-pitched sound. "You are pathetic," she spat. "You will say anything to ruin my moment, will you not? You cannot stand that he chose me. You cannot stand that I am the one getting the castle and the crown while you are sleeping in a shelter." I reached out to grab her arm, to shake some sense into her. "He is going to destroy you." Smack. The sound echoed across the empty asphalt. Her hand connected with my cheek, sharp and stinging. I tasted blood. She leaned in, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. "Wake up, Nia. Nobody cares about the truth. They care about the winner. And I am going to be a queen. Now move your trash car before I call the police and tell them a crazy woman is attacking me. She shoved past me, got back into her Rover, and revved the engine. I moved my car, watching as she peeled out of the lot, tires screeching, leaving a cloud of exhaust in her wake. I touched my burning cheek, watching her taillights fade into the traffic. I had come here to offer her a life raft. I had risked exposure to save my little sister. But as I watched her drive toward her doom, I felt something inside me click shut. It was the final lock on the door of my conscience. I pulled out a red marker from my pocket and opened my notebook. I found the name Keisha on my list of potential allies. I drew a thick, dark line through it. She was not a victim. She was an accomplice. And accomplices get the same sentence as the villain. Preston was not just desperate. He was unraveling. The rejection from the bank had spooked him bad. He knew he could not wait for a traditional closing period on the land. He needed to stake his claim physically and publicly. So he made a manic decision that confused everyone but me. He moved the wedding up. He announced that the ceremony would take place tomorrow afternoon, right in the backyard of the estate. He spun it to the guests as a romantic impulse, a desire to start their lives together immediately. But I knew the truth. He was terrified that if he did not seal the deal legally and physically occupy that land, the syndicate would come for him before the weekend was out. He was literally building his altar on top of a mine to prove he owned it. While he was screaming at caterers to pull off a miracle in 24 hours, I was sitting in the damp storage room of the Pine Street shelter. The air smelled of mold and old cardboard, but to me, it was the perfect war room. I had scavenged parts from a recycling center and built a high-powered signal booster. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating the stripped wires and circuit boards scattered across the table. Preston had changed the physical locks on the doors, but he was arrogant. He assumed that because he held the remote control, he owned the system. He forgot that I was the one who installed the smart home network. I was the one who coded the firewalls. And I was the one who left the back doors open. I initiated the connection sequence. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 20%. 50%. Access granted. Just like that, I was inside. I cycled through the security cameras. I watched as workers rolled out expensive white carpets over the muddy patch in the backyard, trying to hide the melting snow and the geothermal heat. They were setting up the archway directly over the lithium vent. It was almost poetic. I minimized the camera feed and opened the infrastructure controls. One by one, the systems bowed to their true master: lighting, sound, climate control. And then I found what I was looking for: the irrigation system. I studied the schematics. The estate had a dual line system, one for freshwater and one for gray water runoff from the septic tank, intended for deep root fertilization in the far woods. I began typing command lines, rerouting the valve logic. I programmed the system to bypass the freshwater completely and draw solely from the septic reserve. I targeted the sprinkler heads lining the aisle in the main altar. I set the timer to synchronize with the vows. I did not want a drizzle. I wanted a deluge. I watched Keisha on the screen practicing her walk down the aisle. She was shouting at a florist, her face twisted in anger. She looked miserable, but determined. I felt a ghost of the sisterly love I used to have, but I crushed it instantly. They wanted a wedding that people would remember forever. I typed the final execute command and pressed enter. The code locked in. The trap was armed. I closed my laptop and lay back on the cot in the darkness, listening to the shelter settle for the night. Tomorrow, Preston wanted to make a splash. I was going to make sure he drowned in it. I met Mr. Sterling in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city, far away from the prying eyes of the financial district. I looked out of place in my worn clothes and tired eyes, sitting across from a man in a $3,000 suit. But I had something that made my appearance irrelevant. I placed a rugged hard drive on the table between us. Inside that drive was a spectral analysis of the soil from my backyard, the geological data that Preston had killed to keep secret, and the undeniable proof that my family's land was sitting on one of the largest lithium deposits in Georgia. Sterling was a representative for a global energy consortium, the kind of company that did not ask questions about family drama, but cared deeply about raw materials. He plugged the drive into his tablet, his face impassive as the data streamed across his screen. I watched his eyes scan the density charts. He tried to hide it, but I saw the slight twitch in his jaw. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This was not just dirt. This was the future of the battery industry. He leaned back and took a sip of his black coffee. "The data is impressive, Ms. Ward. Or should I say, the late Ms. Ward." He smirked slightly, acknowledging the absurdity of my legal status. "Our geologists have suspected this vein existed for years, but we never had the core samples to prove it. You have just handed us the keys to the kingdom. We are prepared to make an offer." He slid a piece of paper across the table. The number written on it made my breath catch in my throat. $50 million. It was enough money to buy my life back 10 times over. It was enough to bury Preston and my mother in legal fees for the rest of their miserable lives. But I did not reach for the paper. I sat on my hands, keeping my face neutral. "I accept," I said, my voice steady. "But there is a condition. You do not buy it from me. You buy it from Preston." Sterling frowned, confused. "Why would you want us to pay the man who stole your life?" "Because," I said, leaning in close, "he cannot close the deal without the original deed, and I know exactly where it is buried." I explained the trap. Sterling listened, his expression shifting from confusion to admiration. He realized that I was not just selling land, I was orchestrating an execution. I needed him to send the official offer to Preston tonight, right in the middle of his wedding rehearsal. I needed the offer to be contingent on producing the original localized deed, which was inside the black box buried under the altar. Sterling tapped his pen on the table, considering the risk. Then he smiled a shark-like grin that matched my own. "We want the lithium, Nia. If destroying your ex-husband is the price of doing business, then consider it done. We will send the offer at 8 o'clock sharp, with a clause that requires immediate physical verification of the deed." He stood up, shaking my hand. It was the first time in weeks that someone had touched me with respect instead of contempt. As he walked away, I looked at the contract on the table. Preston wanted to be a rich man. I was about to make him the richest man in the graveyard. I finished my coffee and walked back out into the cold, ready to watch the dominoes fall. Here's the detailed script for Block 18, written specifically for a U.S. audience with a dramatic, engaging tone suitable for AI voiceover. The night before the wedding, Atlanta was quiet. From the rooftop of the Pine Street shelter, the city skyline looked like a distant galaxy, a world of wealth and light that I had been exiled from. I pulled my thin coat tighter against the wind, but for the first time in weeks, I did not feel cold. I felt focused. Down below, the city slept, unaware that a war was about to start in the morning. I looked at the burner phone in my hand. The timer I had set on the irrigation system was counting down silently. 14 hours until the I-dos. 14 hours until the sprinklers turned a fairy tale wedding into a hazardous waste site. 14 hours until Preston realized that the woman he erased was holding the eraser. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "The paperwork is ready. Sterling sent the offer. The trap is set. Get some sleep, Ghost." I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Instead, I thought about the little girl I used to be. The girl who desperately wanted her mother's approval. The girl who worked double shifts to buy her sister nice things. The girl who trusted a man because he bought her flowers. That girl was dead. Preston was right about one thing. Nia Ward, the victim, didn't exist anymore. She drowned in a river of betrayal. The woman standing on this roof was something else entirely. I remembered the look in Keisha's eyes when she slapped me. She called me jealous. She thought I wanted her life. She didn't understand that I didn't want the castle. I wanted to burn it down. I wasn't fighting for a seat at their table anymore. I was fighting to flip the table over. I closed my eyes and visualized the plan one last time. Every variable was accounted for. Every exit was blocked. Preston was walking into a minefield of his own making, and I was holding the detonator. They thought they could bury me in a pauper's grave and move on. They forgot that when you bury a seed, it doesn't die. It grows. And tomorrow, they were going to harvest exactly what they planted. I turned away from the skyline and walked back toward the stairs. I was done crying. I was done begging. Tomorrow, I wasn't going to be the ex-wife or the sister. I was going to be the consequence. The silence of the night felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. And as the first light of dawn began to crack the horizon, I whispered into the wind, "Ready or not, here I come." The wedding of the century looked perfect from the high-definition drone feed I was watching on my laptop screen. Preston had outdone himself. He had covered the muddy, heat-leaking patch of earth with a raised platform adorned with thousands of imported white roses. The scent of flowers was meant to mask the sulfur smell of the lithium vent below, a final layer of perfume on a rotting corpse. The guests were the elite of Atlanta. Politicians, bankers, and socialites sitting on white Chiavari chairs, unaware they were merely props in Preston's desperate play for survival. Keisha walked down the aisle to the sound of a live string quartet. I had to admit, she looked stunning. Her custom Vera Wang gown was a cloud of silk and lace, a dress that cost more than 4 years of my college tuition. She reached the altar where Preston stood, looking like the king of the world. He believed he had pulled it off. He had the girl, the land, and the image. The officiant, a bishop my mother had charmed, raised his hands. "We are gathered here today," he boomed, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." I glanced at the timer on my screen. 3, 2, 1, execute. A low subterranean rumble shook the ground beneath the guests' feet. A few people looked around nervously, thinking it was thunder. Then, with a mechanical hiss that sounded like 1,000 snakes striking at once, the perimeter sprinkler heads popped up. But thanks to my recoding of the valve logic, they did not draw from the freshwater reservoir. They drew directly from the septic overflow tank, a reserve of gray water and waste that had not been pumped in a decade. Thick, black sludge erupted into the air in perfect, high-pressure arcs. It was not a mist. It was a deluge. The first jet hit Keisha square in the chest with the force of a fire hose. The impact knocked her back a step, and the pristine white silk turned an instant, horrifying shade of brown. She froze for a split second, her brain unable to process the reality, before the smell hit her. It was a stench of pure rot and decay that made the cameraman retch audibly on the live stream. Pandemonium broke out. The sprinklers oscillated with ruthless precision, spraying the front row of VIPs. Senators and influencers scrambled over chairs, slipping and sliding in the sudden swamp. Their screams were not of joy, but of absolute disgust. "My eyes! It burns!" someone shouted as the black water coated them. Preston stood at the altar, dripping with filth. He did not run. He stood frozen, wiping the muck from his eyes, staring directly at the security camera mounted on the oak tree. He knew. In that moment of absolute humiliation, amidst the gagging guests and his hysterical bride, he knew this was not a malfunction. This was a message. I watched Keisha try to run, but the heavy, soaked dress weighed her down like an anchor. She tripped, falling face first into the mud, thrashing and screaming as her fairy tale turned into a toxic nightmare. I took a sip of lukewarm water in the shelter, feeling a cold satisfaction. They wanted to treat me like trash. Now, they were wearing it. The ceremony was officially washed out, but the real show was just beginning. The silence that followed the sewage explosion was short-lived. As the guests stood there, dripping in filth and gasping for air, a high-pitched feedback screech tore through the massive concert speakers flanking the altar. Everyone covered their ears. The 20-foot LED screen, which was supposed to be displaying a montage of Preston and Keisha's romantic journey, flickered violently. The image of them kissing on a yacht distorted, pixelated, and then vanished. In its place, a grainy, high-definition video appeared. It was footage taken from the security camera in Preston's home office, a feed I had archived 3 weeks ago. The audio boomed across the ruined garden, crystal clear. On the screen, Preston was pacing around his study holding a tumbler of scotch, talking on the speakerphone to his broker. "I do not care what the interest rate is," he shouted in the video. "Just bridge the loan until the wedding. The girl is an idiot. She will sign whatever I put in front of her." A collective gasp went through the crowd. In the mud, Keisha wiped the sludge from her eyes, staring up at the giant image of her fiancé. The video continued. The broker on the line asked about the family. Preston laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the trees. "The mother? Vernice? She is a greedy old hag. I promised her some condo in Florida just to get her to shut up. She actually thinks I have the money. I am going to dump her in a state-run nursing home the second the ink is dry on the deed. And Keisha? She is just a signature with legs. A cash cow. Once I get the mineral rights, I will divorce her and take half of whatever is left. She is too stupid to read a prenup anyway." Preston stood at the altar, his face draining of all color. He looked like a ghost. He lunged for the power cords, frantically trying to unplug the system, but the cables were zip-tied to the steel truss. He was powerless to stop his own confession. Vernice let out a primal scream. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had betrayed her own blood for a lie. She charged toward the altar, her expensive dress heavy with muck, slipping and sliding as she tried to reach Preston. "You liar!" she shrieked, clawing at the air. "You said you loved us. You said we were partners." The guests had seen enough. This was not just a disaster. It was a scandal that would destroy careers. Senators, bankers, and socialites began to flee, stepping over the ruined flowers and overturned chairs to get to their cars. Nobody looked back. Nobody offered help. They just wanted to distance themselves from the stench of the Ward family. Within minutes, the garden was empty, save for the 3 people who had conspired to ruin my life. They were left alone in the wreckage of their own greed, covered in waste, while the video of Preston played on a loop, laughing at them from above. I closed my laptop in the shelter, feeling a cold, hard knot loosen in my chest. The family was not just broken. It was atomized. But I was not done. The emotional destruction was complete. Now, it was time for the financial execution. Preston stood in the middle of the ruined garden, his Italian suit dripping with sludge, watching the last taillights of his wealthy guests fade down the driveway. He was trembling, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of a man who knows he is already dead. The humiliating video had stopped playing, but the silence that followed was louder than the screams. Keisha was sobbing on the ground, wiping muck from her face, while Vernice sat on an overturned chair, staring into the abyss of her own foolishness. Then, a sound cut through the silence. A sharp, cheerful ping from Preston's pocket. It was his priority notification tone, the one reserved for wire transfers and high-stakes deals. He fumbled for his phone with shaking, slippery hands. I watched from my laptop screen as he wiped the screen on his sleeve and squinted at the message. His eyes went wide. The color returned to his face in a rush. He let out a choked laugh, then a shout. "We're saved!" he yelled, holding the phone up to the sky like a religious artifact. "Look at this!" He ran over to Keisha and yanked her up by her arm, ignoring her wince of pain. "Stop crying, you idiot! Look! It is the consortium. They just emailed. They want the land. Tonight." I knew exactly what the email said because I had drafted it myself. It was a formal offer letter from the fictional Apex Mineral Group, offering $50 million in immediate liquidity for the mineral rights. But there was a catch, highlighted in bold text. Due to the volatile nature of the lithium market, this offer expires in 3 hours. Funds will be released upon physical verification of the original geological survey box, known as the Black Box, historically buried at the survey site, the well, to prove pre-zoning compliance. $50 million, Preston gasped, his greed instantly overriding his shame. That pays off the debt. That buys us a new life. We can move to Europe. We can leave this mess behind. He turned to Keisha, his eyes manic. "We need that box. It is under the altar." Keisha pulled away, shivering. "Are you crazy? It is freezing, and the ground is disgusting. We can't dig now." Preston's face darkened. He grabbed her face, his fingers digging into her cheeks. "You do not get it, do you? If I do not wire $5 million to the syndicate by midnight, they are not going to sue me. They are going to skin me alive. And since you are my fiancé, guess who they come for next?" He shoved her toward the shovel that the landscaping crew had left behind. "Start digging, Keisha. We are not leaving this spot until we find that box." I watched them on the screen, 2 figures in a ruined garden, covered in waste, preparing to dig for their salvation. They did not know they were digging their own graves. The black box was down there, all right. I had buried it myself 2 nights ago. But it didn't contain a geological survey. It contained the truth that would put them behind bars forever. I closed the email window and opened the police scanner. It was time to make the final call. The bait was taken. Now I just had to wait for the trap to snap shut. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees, turning the sewage-soaked mud into a semi-frozen slush that crunched underfoot. The floodlights from the security system cast long, distorted shadows across the backyard, turning the ruined wedding arch into the mouth of a cave. Preston was no longer the suave businessman. He was a feral animal. He had ripped off his ruined suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, his forearms smeared with black grime. He shoved a heavy landscaping shovel toward Keisha. "Dig," he commanded, his voice raw from screaming. "The ground is softest near the vent. Start there." Keisha stood, shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. The once glamorous bride looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. Her designer dress was heavy with freezing water, dragging her down. "Preston, please," she sobbed, hugging her arms to her chest. "I can't feel my fingers. It is 5 below zero. We need to go inside. We can look in the morning." Preston laughed, a manic, terrifying sound. "The morning? There is no morning, you stupid girl. The offer expires in 2 hours. If we do not have that box when the courier arrives, we are dead. Do you understand? Dead. Now pick up the shovel, or I will bury you in this hole myself." He grabbed her by the back of her neck, forcing her down toward the mud. Keisha screamed, a sound of pure terror that finally snapped Vernice out of her shock. The older woman scrambled up from the overturned chair, slipping on the icy ground. She rushed forward, grabbing Preston's arm. "Stop it!" Vernice shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and maternal outrage. "Let her go, Preston! Have you lost your mind? This is my daughter! We are going inside right now! I am calling the police!" Preston spun around, his eyes bloodshot and wide with adrenaline. He looked at Vernice not as a mother-in-law, but as an obstacle. With a snarl of pure contempt, he shoved her. It was not a gentle push. He put his full weight into it. Vernice flew backward, her arms flailing, and landed hard in a pile of melting snow and sludge. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, staring up at him in absolute disbelief. The man she had praised, the man she had chosen over her own firstborn, had just assaulted her. "You do not call anyone," Preston spat, looming over her. "You wanted the condo? You wanted the luxury retirement? Then shut up and let me work. I am the only reason this family isn't living in a gutter. I own this house. I own this land. And right now, I own you." He turned back to the steaming patch of earth near the well, grabbed the shovel himself, and drove it into the ground with a grunt of exertion. He began to dig furiously, tossing heavy clumps of wet, black earth over his shoulder. He was digging for his life, fueled by the delusion of $50 million. I watched from the safety of the shelter, feeling a cold detachment. He was tearing up the earth to find his salvation. But all he was doing was digging the evidence pit for the police. The box was down there, waiting like a time bomb. And he was just a few feet away from detonating his own destruction. The sound of the shovel slicing into the wet earth was the only rhythm in the freezing night. Thud, squelch, toss. Thud, squelch, toss. Preston was waist-deep in the hole now, a pit that looked less like a treasure hunt and more like a grave. The security floodlights cut through the steam rising from the ground, casting long, erratic shadows that danced against the fence line. He was panting, his breath coming in white clouds, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He looked deranged, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the dirt with a terrifying intensity. Keisha was on her knees at the edge of the pit, pawing at the loose soil with her bare hands. Her fingernails, manicured to perfection just yesterday, were broken and bleeding. Her wedding dress was a ruined heap of brown sludge, stiffening in the freezing air. She was weeping, a low, constant keen of physical misery. "My hands," she sobbed, holding them up. "They are burning, Preston! I cannot feel my fingers, please! We have to stop!" Preston did not even look up. He swung the shovel with violent force, nearly taking off her hand. "Dig faster!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Do you think the syndicate cares about your manicure? Do you think they care if you are cold? If we do not find that box, you will not have hands left to complain about." He kicked a pile of mud onto her legs. "You wanted the lifestyle, Keisha. You wanted the diamonds. Well, this is how we pay for them. Sweat equity. Now dig." Keisha looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the monster beneath the suit. This was not the man who had whisked her away to Paris. This was a cornered rat, willing to eat its own young to survive. She wiped her nose on her muddy shoulder, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. She realized with a sick, sinking feeling that if she stopped digging, he might actually kill her right here and bury her in the hole. She reached back into the freezing muck, sobbing quietly, scraping at the earth until her fingers were raw. Vernice watched from the porch steps, clutching her bruised arm where Preston had shoved her. She wanted to help. She wanted to scream, but fear glued her to the spot. She was watching the total degradation of her golden child. The daughter she had groomed to be a trophy wife was now a slave in a mud pit. Suddenly, the shovel hit something hard. A metallic clang rang out, sharp and distinct against the dull thuds of the dirt. Preston froze. He dropped the shovel and fell to his knees, clawing frantically at the soil like a dog. He brushed away the layers of clay until the beam of the flashlight reflected off a metal surface. "I found it," he whispered, his voice trembling with hysteria. He looked up at Keisha, his face a mask of triumph and madness. "I found it! We are rich!" He grabbed the handle of the rusted metal box and heaved it out of the hole, cradling it against his chest as if it were his firstborn child. He did not care that he was covered in sewage. He did not care that his wife was hypothermic. He only cared that he held the key to his $50 million. He scrambled out of the hole, slipping on the mud. "Get the laptop!" he screamed. "Get the courier on the phone! We are closing this deal right now!" They stumbled into the kitchen, a trio of mud monsters invading a showroom of luxury. Preston hoisted the heavy iron box onto the pristine white marble island. It hit the stone with a dull, heavy thud, leaving a smear of black sludge and rust on the surface. The room was warm, but the air felt suffocatingly tight. Keisha stood by the refrigerator, wrapped in a cashmere throw she had pulled from the sofa, her teeth still clicking together like castanets. Vernice leaned against the counter, clutching her chest, her eyes fixed on the rusted metal container as if it were the Ark of the Covenant. Preston ignored them both. He was vibrating with a manic energy, his pupils dilated to black saucers. He wiped his muddy hands on his ruined shirt and glared at the heavy padlock sealing the box. It was an old industrial lock, fused shut by years of corrosion and moisture. A normal man would have looked for bolt cutters. Preston went to the utility drawer and pulled out a heavy steel hammer. He did not hesitate. He raised the hammer and brought it down with a primal grunt. The sound of metal striking metal rang out like a gunshot, echoing off the high ceilings. Sparks flew, landing on the expensive cabinetry. He swung again and again. With every blow, he was not just hitting a lock. He was striking back at the bank that rejected him, the guests that fled, and the invisible force that had been tormenting him for weeks. He was bludgeoning his way to freedom. "Is it opening?" Vernice whispered, stepping closer despite her fear. Preston turned on her, brandishing the hammer. "Back off! This is mine! I dug it up!" He turned back to the box, breathing hard, sweat dripping from his nose onto the rusted metal. One final, desperate swing connected with the shackle of the lock. With a sharp crack, the corroded metal gave way. The lock shattered, falling onto the marble counter in pieces. Preston dropped the hammer. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the lid. He looked up at the ceiling, letting out a breathless, hysterical laugh. $50 million, he muttered. "We are going to be legends, Keisha. We are going to buy the whole world." He gripped the cold, sharp edges of the lid. The hinges screamed in protest, a high-pitched shriek of metal grinding against rust. Slowly, agonizingly, he levered the box open. He leaned over, blocking the view from the women, his face illuminated by the under-cabinet lighting. He expected to see the yellowed parchment of a 1920s land deed. He expected to see geological maps. He expected to see his salvation. He stared into the box. For 10 seconds, he did not move. He did not breathe. The manic grin froze on his face, then slowly, terrifyingly, began to curdle into a mask of absolute confusion. He blinked, once, twice, as if trying to force his brain to process the visual input. The box was not empty, but it did not contain land rights. It contained something far more personal and far more deadly. Preston reached into the rusted interior of the box, his fingers brushing against a heavy, waterproof plastic bag. He pulled it out, the plastic crinkling loudly in the silent kitchen. It was not a scroll or a map. It was a single, legal-sized envelope. He ripped the plastic open with his teeth, spitting out a piece of the seal, and snatched the document inside. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the header. He froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse standing upright. It was not a deed. It was a certificate of death. Vernice peered over his shoulder and let out a strangled gasp. It was the original forgery. The document she and her late husband had filed 26 years ago. Nia Ward, date of death, May 14th, 1998. But that was not what made Preston's hands shake uncontrollably. It was a second document stapled to the back. It was a sworn affidavit dated 3 weeks before Preston and Nia's wedding. It was a legal acknowledgement of the fraud, stating that the undersigned was aware of the false identity and agreed to keep the secret in exchange for 50% of all future family assets. The signature at the bottom was bold, arrogant, and undeniable. Preston Vance. Vernice stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew before you even married her. You did not marry her for love. You married her because you knew she was a ghost. You knew you could rob her blind and she could never go to the police. You have been blackmailing us this whole time." Preston crumbled the paper in his fist. "Shut up!" he screamed, but his voice lacked its usual power. He looked back into the box. There was one more item. An old, battery-operated dictaphone, the kind my father used to use for his sermons. Preston's thumb hovered over the play button. He didn't want to press it, but he had to know. He clicked play. The tape hissed for a moment, the sound of the past coming back to haunt the present. Then, my father's voice filled the luxury kitchen, tinny but unmistakable. "If you are listening to this, then Preston has finally made his move," Thomas Ward's voice said. "I am recording this as insurance. We committed a sin, Vernice and I. We killed our daughter on paper to save ourselves from bankruptcy. But we made a deal with the devil. Preston found out. He threatened to turn us in unless we gave him the company, the house, everything. He is not our savior, Vernice. He is our captor. I am burying this proof because I am a coward, but maybe, just maybe, Nia will find it, and if she does, God forgive us." The tape clicked off. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, suffocating. Preston stared at the recorder, his chest heaving. He had come looking for a fortune. Instead, he had dug up a confession. He had dug up the proof of his own extortion racket, and he had done it all while standing in the middle of a trap I had designed specifically for him. Keisha, who had been shivering in the corner, stood up slowly. She looked from the death certificate to the tape recorder, and then at the man she was supposed to marry. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He did not love her. He did not love the family. He had been holding a gun to their heads for 5 years, and now the police were not just coming for a fraud investigation. They were coming for a conspiracy. Preston looked at the clock. 1 hour left on the offer. He looked at the damning evidence on the counter. He grabbed the lighter from the counter drawer. "Burn it," he hissed, his eyes wild. "We burn it all, right now." But as he sparked the flame, the red and blue lights of sirens washed over the kitchen window, painting his terrified face in the colors of the law. The flame in Preston's hand flickered and died, extinguished not by the wind, but by the sheer, crushing weight of the situation. The kitchen was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fishbowl pulsating with the strobe light panic of red and blue police sirens. A voice, amplified by a military-grade megaphone, shook the glass of the French doors. Federal agents. "Come out with your hands above your heads! Do it now!" Preston looked at the lighter, then at the death certificate, and finally at the terrified women. He knew it was over. There was no time to burn the evidence, and even if he did, the house was surrounded. He dropped the lighter. It hit the floor with a pathetic clack. Slowly, defeated, he raised his muddy hands. He marched Keisha and Vernice out through the shattered doors and into the freezing backyard, the scene of his ruined wedding. The garden was transformed. It was no longer a party venue. It was a tactical operation zone. Dozens of agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI and Economic Crimes Division had their weapons trained on the trio. The mud on Preston's face began to freeze, cracking as he shivered. But he did not look at the guns. He looked past them. From the edge of the dark woods, beyond the perimeter of the police line, a new light cut through the gloom. It was not the harsh strobe of a siren, but a steady, blindingly bright, high-intensity floodlight. It turned the night into noon. The agents lowered their weapons slightly, parting like the Red Sea to create a path. And then, she walked out. I stepped into the circle of light, the gravel crunching softly beneath my heels. I was not hiding anymore. I was not the woman in the shelter. I was not the muddy, broken wife he had thrown onto the street. I was wearing a pristine, tailored white wool coat that glowed against the darkness, a stark, violent contrast to the sewage-covered figures shivering before me. My hair was pulled back, my makeup was flawless, and my expression was one of absolute, icy calm. I stopped 5 feet away from them, close enough to smell the stench of their greed. Preston stared at me, his jaw slack. He blinked rapidly, as if his brain refused to process the image. He had spent weeks convincing himself I was a ghost, a non-entity, a legally dead variable in his equation. But ghosts do not wear Italian wool. Ghosts do not bring the Federal Bureau of Investigation to a wedding. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of sunglasses, sliding them on despite the darkness, shielding my eyes from the glare of his destruction. I tilted my head, looking him up and down, at the mud in his hair, the fear in his eyes, and the handcuffs that an agent was currently snapping onto his wrists. "Hello, ex-husband," I said, my voice cutting through the winter air, smooth and sharp as a razor blade. "You look like you have been working hard. Were you looking for me, or were you just digging your own grave?" Preston lunged forward, a guttural sound of rage escaping his throat, but 2 agents slammed him back onto the hood of a squad car. Keisha let out a sob, hiding her face in her hands, unable to look at the sister she had betrayed. Vernice just stared at the ground, finally realizing that the daughter she had killed for profit had just come back to life to bury her. I turned to the lead agent, a man I had been debriefing for the last 48 hours. "Officer, I believe you will find the evidence you need in that black box on the kitchen counter. It contains a confession to federal insurance fraud, identity theft, and extortion. Oh, and add attempted murder to the list. I think the heater in the guest house was tampered with, too." I looked back at Preston one last time. He was screaming now, shouting about his rights, about his money, about the deal. But nobody was listening. The ghost had spoken. And now, the ghost was the only one walking away clean. The arrest should have been routine, but a desperate animal is never predictable. As the agents pressed Preston against the cold metal of the squad car, the air shifted. It happened in a blur, yet my mind processed it frame by agonizing frame, slowing the world down to a crawl. Preston let out a feral roar, twisting his body with a strength fueled by pure adrenaline. He didn't break the handcuffs. He hadn't been fully secured yet. In the chaos, his hand snatched a tactical blade from the belt of the agent wrestling him. With a movement too fast for the mud-slicked officers to counter, he spun around. He didn't lunge for me. He lunged for the person closest to him. He grabbed Keisha by her hair, yanking her violently off the ground. She screamed, a sound that tore through the night, but it was cut short as Preston pressed the serrated edge of the knife against her carotid artery. "Back off," he screamed, his voice shredding the silence. The agents froze, weapons raised, forming a tense semicircle around the maniac and his bride. I stepped back into the shadows, watching the scene unfold with a detached horror. Time seemed to suspend. I saw the steam rising from Keisha's terrified breath. I saw the whites of her eyes, wide and pleading, fixing on mine. For the first time, she wasn't looking at me with envy or contempt. She was looking at me like a little sister, realizing that the monster wasn't under the bed. He was holding her by the throat. "I am walking out of here," Preston spat, saliva flying from his mouth. "I am taking the car. I am taking the girl. If anyone follows me, I will paint this garden red. Do you hear me?" He began to drag Keisha backward toward the open driver's side door. Her feet scrambled uselessly in the sludge, her expensive dress ruined, her dreams of royalty reduced to being a human shield. Vernice let out a low moan from the ground, reaching a trembling hand toward them, but she was powerless. Preston was not bluffing. He had the eyes of a man who saw his own coffin and decided to fill it with company. But he had forgotten one variable. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not negotiate with domestic terrorists in a backyard. I saw it before he did. A tiny crimson dot appeared on Preston's left shoulder, dancing slightly on the fabric of his ruined suit. He was too busy screaming at the lead agent to notice the laser sight of the sniper positioned on the roof of the guest house. "Drop the weapon," the lead agent commanded, his voice calm and final. Preston tightened his grip, drawing a thin line of blood on Keisha's neck. I said back, "Crack!" The sound was dry and sharp, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. The impact was visceral. Preston's shoulder disintegrated in a spray of red mist. The force of the bullet spun him around like a rag doll. The knife flew from his hand, landing harmlessly in the snow. He didn't scream immediately. He just looked at the empty air where his arm had been, his brain unable to comprehend the violence, before his knees buckled and he collapsed into the mud. Keisha fell with him, scrambling away on her hands and knees the second she hit the ground. She didn't run to the police. She didn't run to me. She crawled through the freezing slush toward her mother, burying her face in Vernice's lap, sobbing with the hysterical, broken sounds of a child who has seen the world end. The agents swarmed Preston, pinning him down as he finally began to howl in pain. But the war was over. The king was fallen, and his queen was nothing more than a terrified girl crying in the dirt. The interrogation room was a box of sterile, gray silence, smelling of rubbing alcohol and stale coffee. Preston Vance sat handcuffed to the steel table, his expensive suit replaced by a paper medical gown that rustled every time he shifted. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, a thick pad of gauze covering the sniper's work, but the pain in his eyes was not physical. It was the terrified calculation of a man realizing his life was over. Detective Miller sat across from him, looking bored, flipping through a thick file. He did not need to use intimidation tactics. The bullet hole in Preston's shoulder and the 20 federal agents outside had already done the work. "You are looking at life, Preston," Miller said, not even looking up. "Kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder of a federal witness. And that is before the IRS gets started on your books. Unless you have something to trade, I suggest you get comfortable." Preston leaned forward, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. The arrogance that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by a desperate, rat-like survival instinct. "I can give you the head of the snake," he rasped, his voice dry and cracking. "I am just the middleman. The fraud did not start with me. It started 26 years ago." He nodded toward the one-way mirror, knowing exactly who was being held in the next room. It was Vernice. She is the architect. She is the one who filed the false death certificate. I was just a kid when Nia supposedly drowned. Vernice and her husband set it up. They took the insurance money. They built that house on blood money. When I found out, she begged me not to tell. She told me to marry Keisha. She said if I kept the secret, she would sign over the mineral rights. I watched from the observation room, standing in the shadows. It was a masterclass in cowardice. The man who had claimed to be the patriarch, the protector, was now serving up his mother-in-law on a silver platter to shave a few years off his sentence. He detailed every conversation, every bribe, every moment Vernice had prioritized her bank account over her daughter's existence. He painted her not just as an accomplice, but as the mastermind who had groomed him into the conspiracy. Miller wrote everything down, his pen scratching loudly against the paper. So you are saying Vernice Ward coerced you? Preston nodded vigorously, sweat dripping from his nose. Yes. She is the one who wanted the Florida condo. She is the one who told me Nia was a non-person. She said, and I quote, "Nobody cares about a dead girl." I was just trying to keep the family afloat. I turned away from the glass. Across the hall in interview room B, I knew Vernice was singing the exact same song, blaming Preston for corrupting her innocent family. They were no longer allies. They were hungry dogs in a pit, tearing each other apart to see who could climb out on top of the other's corpse. I had destroyed them without firing a single shot. I simply turned on the lights and let them destroy themselves. The conference room of the law firm was a sanctuary of silence, insulated from the chaos of the outside world by thick oak paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Marcus sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking less like the scrappy public defender I had met in the shelter and more like the high-powered shark he had become. He placed a thick, leather-bound ledger in front of me. The cover was embossed with the seal of a bank that had ceased to exist in the 90s, having been acquired and merged into a financial titan. "Your parents were greedy, Nia," Marcus said, opening the ledger with a deliberate slowness. "But they were not students of estate law. And Preston? He was so focused on the minerals under the ground that he forgot to check the paper trail of the ground itself." He tapped a yellowed document pasted on the first page. "This is the last will and testament of Silas Ward. Your great-grandfather didn't trust your mother. He called her frivolous. So, he set up a generation-skipping trust. The deed to the land was just one part of the asset. The bulk of his wealth was in bonds and blue-chip stocks, designated for his great-grandchildren." I leaned forward, confused. "But if I was dead, wouldn't that money go to my next of kin? Wouldn't it go to my parents?" Marcus smiled, a predatory glint in his eyes. "That is the beauty of it. Silas added a dead hand clause. If the beneficiary dies before the age of 18, the funds do not revert to the parents. They freeze. They go into a blind, interest-bearing trust to be held for 50 years or until a biological claimant with a DNA match proves the death certificate was an error." He spun the ledger around so I could see the bottom line. "When your parents filed that death certificate in 1998 to get the insurance payout, they inadvertently triggered the freeze. They locked themselves out of the real fortune. For 26 years, while you were living on a fake ID and Preston was scrambling for loans, this money was sitting in a dark account, untouched by taxes, fees, or withdrawals." He pointed to the number in the bottom right corner. It was a string of digits that made my head spin. It wasn't just a nest egg. It was an empire. "Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world," Marcus whispered. "While they were treating you like a ghost, your ghost was getting rich. And here's the kicker. Preston couldn't touch this even if he knew about it. Because he married Nia Ward, the identity, the one created by the fake documents. He never married Nia Ward, the heiress, because legally she was in a grave. His marriage license is void. His claim to your assets is void." I stared at the number, feeling a strange weightlessness. Preston had destroyed my life to get $5 million. My parents had sold me for $500,000, and all the while, I had been sitting on a fortune that dwarfed them both, protected by the very lie they had told to exploit me. Marcus handed me a heavy fountain pen. "All we need is a cheek swab to prove you are the biological great-granddaughter of Silas Ward. Once the lab confirms it, the death certificate is annulled and the trust unlocks. You are not just free, Nia. You are the sole owner of everything: the land, the lithium, and the cash. You defeated them by doing absolutely nothing but surviving. I took the pen, my hand steady. I wasn't signing a deal. I was signing my resurrection. The cheek swab was innocuous. A simple cotton tip swirling against the inside of my mouth for 10 seconds was all it took to bridge the gap between 26 years of silence and the present day. I sat in the judge's chambers, a room that smelled of old leather and older laws, watching the lab technician seal the sample into a sterile plastic tube. This was the final hurdle. The physical evidence had put Preston behind bars, but this biology would set me free. For 3 days, I waited. I sat in Marcus's office, staring at the phone, wondering if my own blood would betray me. If the DNA degraded, if there was a mix-up, if the universe decided to play one last cruel joke, I would remain a ghost forever. But the universe was done laughing. We were summoned back to the courthouse on a rainy Thursday. Judge Harlan, a man with a face carved from granite, held the lab report in his hands. He looked at the paperwork filed by my parents in 1998, the faded, fraudulent death certificate that had erased a 4-year-old girl. Then he looked at me. He adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat with a sound that seemed to shake the room. "The genetic markers are conclusive," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with authority. "The DNA sample provided by the plaintiff matches the genetic profile of the Ward family line with 99.9% accuracy. Furthermore, dental records retrieved from the archives match the childhood X-rays of Nia Ward." He picked up a heavy rubber stamp, the wood handle worn smooth by years of judgments. He hovered it over the death certificate, the document that had been my prison. With a definitive, resounding thud that echoed off the mahogany walls, he brought the stamp down. Null and void. The red ink bled into the paper, canceling the lie. He signed the order of resurrection with a flourish. As of this moment, the court recognizes the claimant as the living, breathing Nia Ward. All rights, privileges, and legal standings are hereby restored. Welcome back, Miss Ward. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since I was 4 years old. I wasn't just a body anymore. I was a citizen. I was a person. Marcus squeezed my shoulder, a silent victory lap. But we didn't have time to celebrate. We had a bank appointment. An hour later, we sat in the executive boardroom of the very bank that had thrown Preston out onto the street. The mood here was different. There were no security guards, only nervous executives offering sparkling water and apologies. The CEO himself sat across from me, looking pale. They had been holding the Silas Ward Trust for decades, terrified of the day someone would come to claim it. The numbers appeared on the wall-mounted screen, and the room went silent. The original trust, compounded over 50 years of aggressive market growth, sat at a staggering $180 million. But that was just the cash. Marcus slid the new valuation of the land across the table. Now that the title was clear, the Apex Mineral Group wasn't the only bidder. A bidding war had erupted overnight between 3 major tech giants for the lithium rights. The winning bid, secured this morning, was $300 million. Total assets, $480 million. I stared at the screen. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like a phone number or a coordinate. I looked down at my hands. These were the same hands that had scrubbed toilets in the shelter 3 days ago. These were the same hands that had dug through a dumpster for a clean cardboard box to sleep on. Preston had destroyed his soul for $5 million. My mother had sold her child for $500,000, and I, by simply refusing to die, had inherited a kingdom worth $500 million. The banker slid a digital tablet toward me. "We just need a signature to authorize the merger of the accounts and the transfer of the deed, Miss Ward." I picked up the stylus. My hand didn't shake. I didn't hesitate. I wrote my name, my real name, in graceful, sweeping cursive. Nia Ward. As the screen flashed green to confirm the transfer, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt electric. I wasn't just a survivor of a tragedy. I was the CEO of my own destiny. The money didn't fix the trauma, and it didn't heal the betrayal, but it gave me something I hadn't had in years. It gave me the power to ensure that no one would ever be able to erase me again. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white coat. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply nodded to the room full of men who were now working for me and walked out the door, ready to settle the final score. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and nervous sweat. It was the smell of judgment. Every seat in the gallery was filled. The press, the curious socialites who had attended the wedding, and the former business partners Preston had swindled were all there to witness the final act of the tragedy. I sat on the witness stand, elevated above them all, wearing a sharp navy blazer that cost more than the car I was living in a month ago. My hands rested calmly on the wooden railing. I did not fidget. I did not cry. I was the calm eye of the hurricane that was tearing the Ward family apart. Preston sat at the defense table. He looked like a shadow of the man he used to be. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a bright orange federal jumpsuit that washed out his complexion. His arm was in a sling, strapped tight against his chest, a permanent reminder of the sniper's bullet that had ended his reign. He refused to look at me.